Oh, now I feel awkward because we started
It
it and we
does.
stopped and now it's starting again. Okay. Geordie, welcome back to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast.
Loz, thanks for having me.
No, thank you for having me. Anyway, as I mentioned, I feel we always come up with our next ideas whilst in the middle of another idea. It's kind of an accurate representation of where our minds are at. But today is a really good topic that both of us have wanted to speak about for a little bit because it comes up a lot with clients and on social media and even just in our general chit chats, but the topic of processed food.
Yeah, something we spoke about a fair bit in our last podcast, but it is, and I think it's not something that it's uncommon to see on social media. I probably see 5 to 10 posts about this a day because it's very polarizing. Like people will pick one side or they'll pick the other side, and it's like, no, you absolutely cannot eat any you cannot eat any processed food, sorry. Or it's like, well, they're fine and they have a time and place. But it's funny
Yeah.
because you rarely see anything in between. I guess that's what we're going to get into today.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think processed foods do get a pretty mixed rap. And like you mentioned, if they are being spoken about, generally it's in a pretty negative light. But we could talk about the pros and cons because I think once you understand what the actual definition of food processing is and also the application of it and when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate can kind of help, change your mindset in terms of is it bad, is it not bad?
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same concept we talk about every single podcast is a lot of this misunderstanding comes from miseducation. So let's get into it. Let's break this down. Let's offer a little bit of education. So hopefully we can displace some of that misinformation.
Sounds good. Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of start off with, acknowledging the fact that when we talk about processed foods, people automatically think anything that comes out of a packet. So chocolate bars, muesli bars, chalky milk that we always recommend after a workout, those types of things. But what people don't realize is that unless you are literally drinking milk straight from the cow at the farm, literally everything that you are putting into your body has undergone some level of processing to ensure that it's safe to eat. And I was actually at the shops yesterday just getting some fruit and veg, and I knew we were going to be talking about this. And in Woolies, they have, like organic broccoli in a packet. So like people are thinking, oh yeah, I'm so healthy, I'm having my organic broccoli. But the fact that it's been cut up, cleaned, and put in a packet is actually proof of food processing. So I think people are, as you mentioned, very kind of got the blinkers on in terms of food processing only means muesli bars, whereas food processing is a spectrum and pretty much processed foods are any foods that have been modified from their original fresh or whole state. So ultimately anything that's been washed, cleaned, milled, cut, chopped, heated, pasteurized, blanched, cooked, canned, frozen, fermented, all of these types of processes are food processing. So it's not just, okay, something's been put into a packet, it's processed. If something's been cleaned, it's processed. Milk's pasteurized so that it's safe to consume, that's been processed. So I think being aware of what food processing actually entails can help you to form a better idea of what that is.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest myth that is good to bust out early is that basically everything that 99% of people eat is going to have gone through some type of processing. Like I have friends in New Zealand who literally live off the land. Like that's their concept. They have these huge veggie gardens and they've got animals and they milk goats and cows and things like that. And they go hunting for their meat and they literally live off the land. And that is probably the closest you're going to get to getting a completely unprocessed diet and complete whole food. But that is extreme in itself. Like what they had to do to get to that point is so extreme. And you have to completely change your life and you have to be financially secure enough to be able to do that. Whereas 99% of us, that's just never even an opportunity that we'll be able to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's almost going back to our ancestral ways of living, the caveman diet in a way. They didn't have any food processing facilities that I'm aware of. But yeah, food processing, of course, is what companies do to ultimately get food from farm to our table. And food processing can include adding possibly preservatives or flavors, even additional nutrients sometimes that might be lacking in the original product, food additives and substances that ultimately are approved for use in food products. However, some of those additives also include extra salt, sugars, and fats. And as we're going to get into, it's the types of things that are added to foods that ultimately determine if this is a bad processed food or this is just something that's naturally had to undergo processing so that we can actually consume it.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. I think the point of processing, I think people often think, oh, it's processed, so it's bad. But it's like, well, no, a lot of the time when we're talking about processing food, we're doing it with good intentions, right? Like most foods will go off pretty quickly if you don't add some type of preservative or something in there to increase that shelf life. And just from a practical sense, how are you meant to get that food out and feed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in a community if that thing goes off in 2 to 3 days? It's just not practical.
And processed food and food processing is so much bigger than us. It's not just at the individual level when we're talking about food processing. Of course, in this podcast, we're going to talk about the pros and cons for human consumption. But the reality is that food processing is ultimately what makes these big companies and organizations and farmers money, because without food processing, we don't get to eat, companies aren't going to make money, farmers aren't going to get money. So it's so much bigger than just us and our diet. But I think before we get into the pros and cons, let's just step through the levels of processing, because I didn't realize there was actually such a fine art to how foods are processed. And as with everything in the world, there's this system, it's called the NOVA system. And this ultimately categorizes food based on the level of processing that it's undergone, which is helpful in understanding, okay, is this a bad processed food or is this an okay processed food? And the first category we've got is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And these are foods that are pretty much in their natural state, but parts of the plant have been removed purely so that we can consume them. So this is seeds, fruits, leaves, stems, roots. For example, you're not going to have your carrot and the roots. I mean, you might want to, but typically that's not how they're eaten. And minimally processed foods are foods that are altered by the process, including the removal of those unwanted parts. For example, if you pull a carrot out of the ground, it's unprocessed, but as soon as you remove the roots and kind of clean off the dirt, they've been minimally processed, just for context. The second category is processed culinary ingredients. And these are our things such as oils, butter, sugar, and salt, which are ultimately from nature, but they have undergone some sort of process so that they can be used in the production of foodstuffs. And then we move on to category 3, which is processed foods. And these are foods such as bottled and canned vegetables, canned fish, fruits and syrups, like those little fruit cups you get from the supermarket, cheeses, and even breads. So processes here include preservation or cooking methods. And when we're talking about cheese or those kind of pickled vegetables, ultimately it's types of fermentation as well. And most processed foods have 2 to 3 ingredients. So, it might not just be the milk, might be milk, but it also might have some sort of enzyme or other ingredient in it, just so that we can consume it. But the big bad category, so to speak, is the 4th category, which is our ultra processed foods. And this is probably where we should spend a little bit of time, because out of all 4 categories, this one, ultra processed food, seems to be the only one that gets attention, and very negative attention, which, as we soon discuss, is totally justified, but still important to realize that this is still only one category of processed food.
Yeah, it's important to realize exactly that, right? That there are levels to how processed a food is, because when people often say this to me and they go, you know what, I don't eat processed food, I don't have it. And then you go, well, what do you eat then? And then they start listing things and you're like, well, you actually do eat processed food. You just don't eat ultra processed food. You don't eat extremely processed food, but you are eating things that are minimally processed or have had things added to it that are fortified. And again, it's just that lack of information. And I'm sure something we probably talk about at the end, but we'll bring up now is like, why is that even important? Like, why is using that language important? It is because there's a lot of miscommunication, especially in the sporting world. Like, we'll talk about this in a bit, is that when people demonize, like, oh, well, get away from this processed food. It's like, well, no, like if you're telling athletes or just regular people, get away from these processed foods, and you haven't explained, like, look, there's these levels to this. And yeah, maybe ultra processed foods, let's have a look and try to minimize that. But you can have unprocessed or minimally processed food, and that's probably going to make up the bulk of your diet, and that's okay. Telling them that is powerful, because otherwise you start this fear mongering, and that can lead to a whole heap of issues. Like that can lead to disordered eating disorders, underfueling, all of these problems that come by just not getting the language right. And I think that one of the most important things I want you guys to get out of this podcast is understand that language, because it's important. Like ultra processed food, yeah, that's right up this end, but the most other foods can be eaten in a really healthy and a really performance-based diet that is still minimally processed or had some type of processing to them.
Really great point, Geordie. And it goes for other topics as well, in terms of the fear mongering of, if you're told or you're led to believe that you need to avoid some sort of food, you could actually do yourself a disservice by, becoming underfueled or have a micronutrient deficiency, purely because you have this idea in your head about, I can't consume this type of food group. So yeah, I think really great point there in terms of it is important to know the levels and also the language that we do use around food, even for us talking to our clients.
So let's get into it then. Ultra
Yeah.
processed food, break it down for us, Loz.
Yeah, for sure. So ultra processed foods are typically foods that contain five or more ingredients, and these can include substances extracted from foods and substances derived from other further processing of food components. So ultra processed foods can also contain additional additives such as colors, flavors, non-sugar sweeteners, and processing aids. And common ingredients you might see on the back of, say, a muesli bar or packet of chips. See things such as lecithin or MSG, sodium nitrite, artificial flavors or natural colors, xanthan gum, high fructose corn syrup. All of these things are different types of additives or mixing ingredients that are ultimately put into the food that we have to either one, maybe change the texture, increase the shelf life, make it tastier, make it saltier, make it sweeter, so that we, as such, enjoy consuming it, want to buy more. Again, doing the big corporations a favor here because we love the food so much because of whatever they put in it that we keep buying it. But when we're talking about ultra processed foods, these are the things such as our soft drinks, sweet and savory snacks, ice cream, breakfast cereals, even breakfast bars, chocolate, lollies, mass produced breads, bread rolls, pancakes, all those things you get pre-made in the supermarket, margarine spreads, even deli meats, your sausages, bacon, all of these things are our ultra processed food. And when you look at that group of food that I just listed, you can see why processed foods get a bad rap, and it's totally justified because you know the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating ultimately lists all these types of food as discretionary items, which are outside of our healthy eating circle because we shouldn't eat them all the time. And of course, they all play a role. They're justified. Weekend barbecue with your mates. Of course, you're going to cook some snags on the barbie, or it's not that you need to avoid them, but it's just being aware that these are the types of foods that shouldn't make up the bulk of our diet, and they're kind of just off to the side in terms of should have them sometimes, but if they are consumed in excess, then yes, that's when it's going to start to maybe lead to health implications that we can talk about.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this point, and we're obviously going to go over the pros and cons of it. But I think a good point that I always make when people have this discussion with me is like, okay, yeah, we can all appreciate that ultra processed food, you shouldn't be having a lot of it, but you need to look at it. How does that look in the totality of your diet, and how much of these are actually like, what's the contribution of these to your overall health? So
Yeah.
in other words, yeah, if you are consuming lots and lots and lots of ultra processed food and they're making up, say, 80% of your diet, that's probably going to have a pretty negative contribution to your overall health. But if you're someone who wakes up every morning, they go walk the dog for an hour, they come back home, they make a really good smoothie, they put lots of fruit and veg and protein in there, and then they go to work, and then they, keep drinking their fluids, they eat another really good snack, another really good meal. At lunchtime, you go do some yoga, and then, at nighttime, you're going to go do some more workout, or you go for a run with your friends, and then you come home and you relax, hang out with your family. You live a very healthy lifestyle. Are you going to try and tell me that that person at the end of the night who goes to the fridge and gets, I don't know, a muesli bar or a chocolate or an ultra processed ice cream or something, does that ultra processed ice cream at the end of the day, does that cancel out the totality of that person's lifestyle? And when you put it like that, I think it seems ridiculous, right? But I think we like to hyper focus on these things, and you see people really hyper focus and villainize these foods when really, like we always say on this podcast, you've got to step back and don't just focus on this one little system or this one little thing, and look at the totality of not only that person's diet, but their lifestyle. And does eating that overall make them unhealthy? And for that person I just described, I think it would be absolutely ridiculous to try and even make an argument of, yeah, that person having that ice cream or whatever at the end of the day, that makes them unhealthy considering everything else they do in their day.
It's important as well. Yeah. I mean, we're not saying be a fence sitter, but it's important to acknowledge not only the bad things with something, but also choose to see the good in it. And I think that's a great point, Geordie. And coming off the back of that, let's shed some light, positive light, I reckon, on processed food. And we'll start with the pros of food processing. And one of the biggest ones is ultimately food safety. Food processing makes products safe for human consumption. As I mentioned earlier, cleaning, heating, pasteurizing, all these types of processes ultimately rid food of bacteria, increase shelf life. So food processing is great for food safety and being able to, buy stuff. Imagine if during COVID, remember, everyone was bulking up stuff. If it wasn't for food processing, everyone would have empty cupboards because food processing allows us to have food. We don't have to worry about eating it within one day. And also, if we're traveling, I think we spoke about taking long life products away with us. It's great for things like that. If you're traveling, things don't need to be in a fridge or a microwave. So food safety is a huge pro for food processing. Convenience is another one, because processed foods or packaged foods are ultimately readily available, easy to grab on the go. Of course, we always say, prep your meals, take some time to make snacks and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is sometimes we're busy. We need to swing by the servo and grab a muesli bar and a coffee or something like that. And food processing makes foods really convenient for us to just grab and go, eat on the go, eat at any time. Another one with food processing is also food fortification. So of course, adding too many things to foods can be bad for our health, such as adding added sugars, salts, fats, etc. But some products, such as say Wheat Bix, for example, or a lot of your breakfast cereals, they're actually fortified with a lot of vitamins and minerals, which for the general population, we're probably actually already meeting our requirements, but for maybe at-risk populations, or maybe even if you're pregnant and you need more requirements than normal, food fortification is actually a really great way for us to stay on top of our micronutrient targets, whether that's folate or iron, calcium, all those types of things. Companies can actually fortify our food with vitamins and minerals through the processes of food processing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't be considering all of those things. That's completely true, right? Like, and the point with COVID, look at the shops. So not even COVID, when anything happens, there's a bit of flooding. There's, I don't know, someone makes any type of announcement or it's a long weekend. What happens at the grocery stores? Everyone just stocks up their shelves. Like, that's just not possible. Or it wouldn't even be possible to restock those shelves as fast as what those grocery stores do without having food, processed food available to be able to do that. But that's all the positives. Loz, take us through what the negatives are of them.
Definitely, yeah. So just coming off the back of food fortification, yes, we can add good things into our food, but you can also add things that we don't quite want excess in our diet, such as added salt, sugars, and fats. And you'll often see on food packaging, no added sugars or salts, and companies are proud of that, because a lot of companies do add extra salt, sugar, and fat. So food processing typically are going to be higher in those types of ingredients. Also, depending on the level of processing, foods might become actually nutritionally incomplete. For example, taking wholemeal bread to white bread, that type of processing removes the fiber content of the food. So processing sometimes can get rid of the things that we actually want. I think a good example of this as well is all those people that have a juicer on their counter. They chuck their fruit and veg in there and think they're being awesomely healthy, but all that bulk that's left over, there's a lot of fiber and there's a lot of good stuff in there that we're missing out of. So that's a visible example of food processing that you can see, in terms of sometimes we're actually reducing the nutrient content of our foods through these food processes. As well, there is a lot of kind of information out there, and this is probably where people form their ideas of processed food equals bad, because there is an association or supposed link between a high intake of ultra processed foods and non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. And there are a few articles out there you read between the link of a high processed food diet and cancer, or deli meats and cancer, or cooking your food too long on the barbecue and cancer. So there are a lot of correlations out there. I think, it kind of depends the science and where that's at, but there is as well that obvious kind of link between a diet that's very high in processed foods with poor diet quality and the risk of increased obesity and body weight as well.
Yeah, it's a real problem. And I'll bring it back to that situation before. And if we look at the flip side of that, say if that person isn't living that extremely healthy lifestyle and they're super dependent on these ultra processed foods and they take a lot of them, you generally tend to see these negative health outcomes with it. And I think that is a valid argument in itself, right? And I think that's the argument that a lot of these people that take these extreme views get away from. That's what they're leaning on, right? And in a sense, they're not wrong. Like, they're not wrong. If the bulk of your diet is mostly ultra processed food and you're not doing other things to try and live a healthier lifestyle, then yeah, your risk of unhealthy outcomes is going to be higher. Something I tell a lot of my clients that say, you know what, I really enjoy like getting burgers or pizzas or whatever, or making pancakes, but I don't want to have these processed things. A simple fix to that is, one, you need to appreciate that you can have it every now and then. You can have it, but if you want to cut down on it, I always say to them, eat whatever the heck you want, just make it yourself. Like, just go home and just make it yourself. If you want a pizza, if you're craving that frozen pizza and it's not just a time thing where you can just throw it in and go do everything else and then come back and grab it, spend a bit of time, like get a dough, like make a dough, get like, you don't even have to be fancy. Just throw some tomato like paste on there and then add some good cheese on there and boom, you've got a homemade pizza that has way less ingredients than the thing that you're going to be taking out of the freezer section in that supermarket. So eat whatever you want and just make it yourself. But it's important to make that distinction of they're not that bad. Like if the totality of your diet doesn't include all of these foods and you're doing 80 to 90% of everything right, then in the totality of your diet and lifestyle, those things are probably not going to be adding too much damage.
It's the 1%ers, hey. It's like
Yeah.
if you're not focused on kind of your diet in a whole and the only one thing you're hyper focused on is the amount of processed food in your diet, you're probably not focusing on the main factor here, which might be, you know, hitting your carbs or making sure you're drinking enough water. It's again, like you said, not being hyper focused on one thing. And processed food exists on a spectrum. I think another good example is say white chocolate and dark chocolate. Like the change in processing between those two things is crazy, but people still associate white chocolate, dark chocolate, both processed foods. And yeah, processed foods does exist on a spectrum. But I think something that we should finish off with, given that we are sports dietitians, Geordie, is the application of processed foods to sports nutrition. I think I mentioned it on a previous podcast, that Instagram post I did a few months back about changing the way we view processed foods in the sporting scene. Because when we are talking about sports nutrition, often you see us talking about rice bubble bars or sports gels or a carb powder, sports drink, all these types of things, which when you think about it, they're either processed or ultra processed foods. And we're here telling athletes, elite level athletes, to eat these types of things. And people, you know, sometimes I've had a few comments made, oh, why do you encourage people to eat processed foods? Or why should we have that? You know, athletes need to be healthy. And I totally understand their perspective, but it's also important to realize that these types of foods don't make up the bulk of an athlete's diet, or they shouldn't. It's about optimizing our nutrient timing and the delivery of the food for optimal performance. And processed foods help us do that, because we're always talking about how quickly we want food to be digested for us to be used as energy. And food processing sometimes take away a couple of those processes so that once we eat them, it's a lot quicker process in terms of how quickly that carbohydrate from our rice cake is digested, absorbed, and sent to our muscles as glucose so that we can use it for energy. And with sports nutrition, you know, a big thing is carbs. But, you know, for endurance athletes as well, they've got to be eating whilst they're training. And if we go along the whole anti-processed food bandwagon, imagine trying to get your cyclist to consume, I don't know, half a raw sweet potato versus just smashing maybe 2 gels. That cyclist is not going to be very happy with you if you're making him consume raw, unprocessed vegetables, because the bulk, just the logistical barrier of trying to eat that type of volume. Processed food can allow us to get a smaller amount of food that's easier to digest, easier to use as energy, in a much easier package as well. So it comes back to convenience, food safety, comfortability, and just, again, the situation. You wouldn't tell someone, maybe, I don't know, on a weight loss journey, or someone that was really trying to focus on increasing their whole foods, you wouldn't encourage them to necessarily adopt a processed food diet. But if you've got someone about to go and run a 50K ultra through the forest, you're going to want them to have small, convenient foods that they can have quickly and that are going to digest.
Yeah, I was actually having a consult with one of my runners, and we were talking about this because he has a very, very good traditional Mediterranean diet, very good base diet, but he's very, very anti-processed foods. But I convinced him to just try, before some of his higher intensity running sessions, to get in a Powerade and have some pikelets and have some berries and add some syrup to it. And it was funny because he was giving me this speech about, you know, how he doesn't like all the things and calorie and blah, 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 and all the things they add to these sports drinks. But he goes, oh, it's funny though, because those sessions that I ate what you put down to me, man, I really felt the difference. Like I really, really felt good. And I really like put out good times. And I was thinking during it, like, what's the difference here? And the only difference was what I put in my body. And it's interesting, right? Because in his mind, he's hyper focusing on just that. Like he's hyper focusing on, oh, these are processed, which is really the total consumption of those foods, even calorically compared as a percentage of his overall daily diet, is so small. Yet what he does right before training is going to positively impact that training session, which is going to have positive flow-on effects for not only his performance, but his health later on. But yet he still chooses to hyper focus on that when it's a very appropriate thing. And his overall diet is exceptionally good. And it's an interesting thing, right? Because I often have this conversation when I talk to other people in the ultra world that do what I do, and they go, "Oh, I don't want to have, gels or whatever." I personally, I don't like gels, and it's not for the fact that they're processed or whatever. It's just I don't like the taste of them. And when I talk to people, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I just don't want to have these gels because they're so processed. I don't want to be having these." It's like, yeah, but you're not eating gels for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Like, and the thing is, when you're out there and you're training, and if you push your body to the point where it needs that fuel, those gels look very appealing. Like, I'm not a big fan of them, but I will take a gel if I need carbohydrates and I know my body needs them. I'm not a big lollies person, but I will definitely eat snakes or jelly beans or whatever when I'm out on the trail. If I'm hitting a certain pace and I know I'm starting to get depleted, that stuff looks extremely enticing. It tastes enticing, and you see an immediate benefit because that is what your body needs. And in the overall totality of what you're doing when you're out there burning over 4,000 calories and you're just putting in a handful of jelly beans or whatever, it's absolutely nothing. It's absolutely nothing. Your body doesn't care. Your body just wants those simple sugars. It wants to rip it in. Plus, you're out there being active for hours on end. Plus, you probably have a really good training and recovery and sleep cycle, and you drink lots of water throughout the week. So it's fine. Eat your freaking jelly beans. You're going to get a better time, and mentally you're going to feel even better afterwards as well.
Really good point, and super important to have that differentiation between, okay, this is just a around sports thing, it's not a 24/7 thing. And I really do admire people that have such a beautiful whole food, diet, because, and as well, you feel it, you feel great when you're eating fruits, veggies, meats, all those types of things. You really do feel awesome, but you feel awesome as well when you're about to go for a run and you just had, a muesli bar or a gel. So it's, the setting and the use really is important here. And I hope this podcast kind of can help you to determine in your own mind, okay, maybe they're not as bad as I thought, and there is a time and a place for it. But we are definitely, not encouraging you to eat processed foods for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because that it's true. You don't want to be constantly putting these processed foods into your body. However, there is a time and a place, and sports nutrition is one of those times and places.
Yeah, it's an interesting combo, and we're doing this again where I'm thinking of a topic we talk about in a later combo. But I think like ultra endurance, like the space I'm in, is super interesting when we talk about this, because it's not like we're just going out for a half marathon or a marathon when you're done in 3-4 hours. We're out there for,
Yep.
8, 10, 12, sometimes, 24 hours. So then that conversation goes, well, you want to fuel this performance, but if you're doing that and you're training, you're spending a lot of your time eating these particular foods. And that's when we can even have a conversation. You go, well, yeah, then, okay, we can swap, and maybe we do need to just limit these processed foods, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a place. That does not mean that they don't have a place when you're racing or you're doing particular types of training. And it's something athletes, I'll go back to the first point I made, they make a lot of misjudgments about things because of misinformation and miseducation. And I think one of the best things as an athlete, especially if performance is your goal, if you don't really care about performing at your best and whatever, go do whatever. But if you are competitive and you want to do your best and you just want to beat whoever you were yesterday and all that jazz, you need to understand these things because it makes a massive difference. Like, coming from someone who's done it themselves and worked with thousands of athletes, if you get this nutrition right and you get this idea of adequate fueling and you kind of get that, oh, it's super processed, out of your mind, it makes a huge, huge difference to your overall performance. And you're going to benefit from it, not just tomorrow or the next day. You'll benefit immediately from doing it.
Really good point, Jodie. No, I think it was a good chat, and I'm glad we finally spoke about it. And hopefully, it helps our listeners to, understand maybe their current prejudice on the whole processed food topic. Because I love a good muesli bar or love yogurt. Those things are both processed, So it can, as with everything, there is a place in our diet for it. And yeah, I suppose our next topic will be the one that we're both alluding to, but not going to mention, so it's a surprise.
All right, Loz, I'll chat to you next time.
Cheers, Jodie.